Good day, welcome to today's lesson. This is lecture 3 or lesson 3, and today's topic we would be looking specifically at solid waste generation. So when we talk about solid waste management, solid waste generation is the first point of concern in the entire management process of solid waste management that we have to pay attention to. The wastes, as you recall, includes all types of solid and semi-solid material that is no longer considered of sufficient value to retain. So that's how we define the solid waste that we are looking to manage or control. So with regards to generation rates now, we can define generation rates, that is solid waste generation rates, as the amount of waste generated by one person or one household in one day, and this would usually be expressed in terms of weight. For example, we could express it in terms of grams, kilograms, etc. It really depends on the volume of waste we're dealing with. Now, generation rates, this is important in the entire solid waste management process because it gives an indication of the total amount of waste that would have to be collected and disposed of. So as a solid waste manager, solid waste management person, you would need to know these kinds of figures because this kind of data would be necessary for you to be able to plan proactively ahead of time so that you can have everything that you need in place for the management process. For example, you're talking about planning for all the facilities that would be required for collection, such as vehicles, what types of vehicles, how many, what kinds of frequency of collection. Then you also have the issue of final disposal at the landfill or whether it's incineration. So we need to know what volumes we're dealing with, and generation rates help us to plan strategically for how we're going to manage our waste. So generation rates typically, it's a challenge to get accurate information. Generally, we find there is a lack of availability of reliable data on generation rates. Many times when you see these rates published in any reports, they would tend to be average rates, estimates. Alright, and so typically what you would tend to find is that as a result you will find that field measurements or field surveys will have to be carried out in order to fill in the blanks, fill in that uncertainty with regards to generation rates. Because remember, the generation rates can only really be truly determined at the source of generation, for example at the home, at your household. So typically local authorities, the staff are really able to give reliable information regarding generation rates unless the authority, so this would be like your municipal authority or regional corporation. So if they have a weighing bridge at their disposal site, that's the only way they can actually give accurate figures. So weighing bridge facilities, this is an example of what it may look like. So you see there you have the truck. That would be an example of a disposal truck, for example, and that structure, that ramp that you see it on top of there, that ramp would actually have a scale associated with it. So when the truck drives onto the bridge, they would have information such as the weight of the truck before the load and the weight of the truck after the load, so that they can make a determination of the actual weight of the load. And information like that could be very useful in terms of determining generation rates. This chart, this map that we're looking at, gives us an idea of what typical generation rates look like globally. So if you if you follow with me, the little note here that says note the location of the highest and lowest generation rates. So what you're actually seeing is, if you follow with the legend at the bottom, you see that the highest generation rates would be this dark brown color, and the lowest generation rates would be the very pale color. Of course, where you see white, that means that no data was available. So if you really look at what is happening here, you would see that the majority of the world that seem to have the highest generation rates seem to be the richer countries, right? This is the US here. Canada to the north is also fairly high. Brazil and a few other Latin American countries. Mexico produces a fairly high waste generation rate. Then we have Russia and China to the north. Okay, and the rest of the world seem to be significantly lower. So basically what I want you to note here is that there is a direct correlation between waste generation rates and affluence of whether it is a household, a community, or a national economy. Affluence directly influence waste generation rates. Also, I want you to look at this table here, waste generation rates by sectors. So the sources of waste generation, as we had looked at before, we have listed here municipal, industrial, demolition, and other municipal. So I really want you to look specifically at this column here, where we have kilograms per capita. So that would be per person, right? What you find here is that your highest waste generation per person occurs in municipal environment. So that municipal environment, for example, that urban environment, which also includes residential and other built-up areas, we tend to produce the highest waste generation, followed by industrial and demolition and other municipal. Okay, so really the point of this is to help you identify patterns and relationships in waste generation rates. Now we're going to look at factors affecting waste generation rates. This is just a summary chart of the points that we're going to look at. So I'm not going to go into it in any detail. So we will move on from there. So these are all the factors that influence the rate at which we produce waste. So the first thing we want to look at is source reduction. Source being the point at which the waste is being produced. So source reduction, at that point, this can actually occur in a few different ways. If you think about it, for example, in terms of manufacturing, let's say an industry that's manufacturing something, you can reduce waste by making modifications to the design of your product, the manufacturing process itself, or through the packaging of the products. Because as we have seen before in the previous lesson, when we looked at materials flow analysis, you would have learned that at every stage of the process we actually produce waste. So we would have to look at that and determine what changes can we make to minimize or even eliminate that waste if possible. So by doing that, we can minimize waste through the toxic content of the materials that we use. So we can minimize the waste in terms of pollution, toxic pollution. If you change the type of material you use, for example, you can minimize waste in terms of the volume of the material that you use. We looked at that as well in last week's lesson, where we looked at how to reduce the packaging, change the design of the packaging to reduce the amount of packaging that you use. And also, what about the design of the product itself? Can it be designed in such a way for it to last longer? So if you have a longer life to the product, you will have you would not have the fast turnover of purchase of products that you normally have, which increases the rate of waste generation. At the source reduction, this may also occur in households, as mentioned before, commercial or industrial facilities. This can also be achieved through selective buying patterns. So consider your household, for example. How do you buy your products, your groceries, etc.? One thing you may want to consider is, if I buy in bulk, can I reduce my waste? I can possibly reduce my waste because the packaging is reduced. So therefore the packaging waste that I would normally produce would be reduced. You could also look at what products and materials can be reused. For example, your glass jars, bottles. You can reuse bags, etc., thereby reducing the rate at which you produce waste. The extent of recycling that exists in a community or a country can also affect the rate of waste generation. So for example, the existence of recycling programs within your community, this can affect the quantity of waste that you produce, because for example, the waste, instead of going directly to the landfill, it will be redirected either back into the process for recycling into another product. So if you have recycling programs existing in a community, you find the final volume going to your landfill would be reduced. Then we look at public attitudes. So reduction in quantities of waste, solid waste generated. This occurs when and if people are willing to do what? Are they willing to change their habits and lifestyle in order to conserve natural resources? So a big part of enabling people to change their habits and lifestyle would be education. But many times that education is not enough. Many times it would require the use of somewhat harsher measures, such as legislation and laws and enforcement of those laws to get people to cooperate. Also, people's attitude might change based on the economic situations existing in the country. If a country is going through a recession, for example, you find people would be more likely to want to conserve. And when you have a change in attitude in terms of your buying and your consumption, what happens is you now reduce the economic burden associated with solid waste management. So for example, once you reduce those volumes, the amount of finances required in order to facilitate the proper disposal of these large volumes of waste can now be reduced. So as mentioned before, legislation also plays a role in the rate of waste generation. So legislation is an important factor with regards to waste generation types. For example, here we have legislation, this is a UK example, legislation dealing with packages. So packaging. So what this legislation does is that it requires producers to pay a portion of the cost of the recovery and recycling of their packaging. So the packaging from their products, now money is already set aside. When I purchase a particular product from them, it is included in the cost, and that cost, that portion of that cost goes towards the cost of a recycling and recovery program. Geographic location can also affect waste generation rates. So for example, when we look at different types of climate, the amount of certain types of waste generated can be reflected, or you would notice patterns based on the climate. For example, you would find warmer climates because we have longer growing periods. As we see here, warmer climates, longer growing periods, there is a greater opportunity for greater waste generation of certain types of organic materials such as yard and garden waste, etc. Whereas in a colder climate, growing seasons are shorter. in temperate climates, you know, they have 4 seasons. Growing seasons would be significantly shorter, so therefore your organic waste would be significantly less. Season of the year, also related to the previous point. So you find quantities of certain types of solid waste, they're influenced by the season. So there are particular times of the year when you will find an increase in organic waste, such as summertime, spring, etc. However, of course, in the tropics we have wet and dry season. So our growing seasons here, it's pretty much year long, and depending on the particular types of crops, so we have significant amount of organic waste produced throughout the year. Another factor affecting waste generation, or rather the handling of the waste that is generated, is the frequency of collection. So in situations where you have unlimited collection service, where that is available, you find more waste is collected. What is important to note here, though, this does not mean that you actually have larger volumes of waste. It just means that you have more waste collected. So there is more information gathered here, and you may find differences in the collection frequency. Different parts of different communities, for example, you find maybe urban communities may have more regular collection than more rural communities, etc. Then we have the characteristic of the service area. So we have peculiarities of service areas that can influence the quantity of waste generated. So we're still talking about waste generation. For example, quantities of yard waste generated per capita would be considerably greater in wealthier neighborhoods than in other parts of your community. So again, here we're making a connection with affluence. Where you have wealthier neighborhoods, you can expect to have increased waste generation compared to poorer neighborhoods. Alright, this table here just serves to further emphasize that point we have been making. So here we have a table that shows 3 income levels: low, medium, and high. And I really want you to look at the income levels related to the ton per capita per year. Alright, so that's the amount of solid waste generated. So if you compare low income, 0.1 to 0.6 tons per capita per year for low income, and you compare that to high income, there is a significant difference. For high income, we have 0.3 to greater than 0.8. So that is a big difference between the two. Okay, so again, this emphasizes there is a relationship between affluence and waste generation rates. So this concludes the first part of today's lesson. I would like you at this point to now please proceed to part 2 of today's lesson. Thank you.